my part of this gets edited out, so I'm very pleased to be here and welcome you on behalf of the vestry and people of St. James. I'm David Peck, and all of you online and in person that are able to join us as we welcome Reid and Janelle Trulson as they open this weekend for us, a weekend of mission studies, Baptist studies, and 19th century church history. I'm not sure when the last time Baptists took over an Episcopal church, but I rejoice in it now, and I hope it happens more often in the future. All the more so as many of the dear friends and fellow missionaries of the Trulsons gather here for this event. We're able to welcome all of you who have flown in and driven from different corners of the country to celebrate the publication of Charlotte Rowe, the story of America's first appointed woman missionary by the Reverend Dr. Reid Trulson. It's remarkable to welcome so many Attlee family members here in person and online who continue their connections with this historic parish. The primary purpose of this format and lecture is to be online and recorded as an event. The point of that exercise is itself a work of digital evangelism and mission, so that academics and missionaries and Christians in South Asia and Southeast Asia, Europe and North America can, like we will be today, inspired by the life of Charlotte Rowe. A life given fully and bravely to Christ, to his church, to the human family, and to the people of India, despite the patriarchal powers that so sinfully and outrageously did not want her to flourish in her fullness, because she was, of course, only a woman, only a widow, only a mother or school teacher. Anglicans and Baptists have not always agreed on the doctrine of the communion of saints, but we would all agree that whether we live or die, we are the Lord's possession, and that happy from now on are those who die in the Lord, for they shall rest from their labors. That Charlotte and her twin daughters found rest for their mortal remains in this churchyard after so many labors and missionary journeys and losses is a deep consolation to me as a pastor. That her life 200 years later is still drawing together the church across states, across oceans, and across denominations should seriously inspire us today. Thank you, Reid, for this weekend and for the restoration of Charlotte's life to its proper place, both locally and globally. Now, having welcomed you to this occasion, I now invite our parish historian, Dr. Cordelia Moyes, to introduce Reid formally. God has given this parish not only a love of history generally and church history, but through many people, the capacity to care for its archives and fabric that you see all around you for nearly 300 years. That our parish historian and archivist has spent her academic life integrating church and women's history with imperial history and mission studies is just another astounding piece of providence for which we can all thank God today. Cordelia.
I first heard of the Reverend Dr. Reid Trulson in the summer of 2017 through emails and conversations he had with my predecessor, Leo Shelley, who was then the archivist and parish historian here. Reid and I subsequently struck up our own email correspondence to share insights, resources, and encouragement. As our interest in each other's work developed, he offered me the chance to join him and a group of colleagues with whom he had worked as director and CEO of the Baptist Agency International Ministries to go to India with them and to follow in the footsteps of Charlotte. I then said to David, "There is this guy I met online who now wants me to go to India with him. I think we should probably meet him for lunch before I say yes." And so began a delightful friendship, still in its early days, between Janelle, Reid, David, and me. The trip to India in the fall of 2019 was profoundly moving for me as I experienced the wisdom, faith, and fellowship of missionary Baptists in our own generation. They have truly followed in the footsteps of Charlotte. Reid's research couldn't have come at a better time for me personally or the parish, as we were just embarking on our 275th anniversary year, for which the church had commissioned me to write its first social history. This allowed me and the team of historians working with me to incorporate Charlotte in our exhibition at Lancaster History. I am delighted to announce today that new historic markers will shortly arrive in the churchyard outside this wall, which will tell something again of Charlotte's story to all who visit our campus. This coming year, we are also planning to commission a headstone for her, as she does not have one for her own grave. Reid's book is one of astonishing breadth and depth. It is informed by the intellectual rigor, writing, and research skills that God has given him. It is also suffused with the graces of a lifetime of international ministry service, through which he and Janelle and their families have experienced the riches, the sufferings, and the blessings of Baptist life, spirituality, and worldwide mission. It is a great honor for me today to welcome Reid to speak to us now. Thank you.
Who was Charlotte Rowe? Why is she buried in St. James Cemetery? And why does it matter? Those are the three questions we're going to probe this afternoon. Charlotte Hazen Attlee was born here in Lancaster in 1782 at the end of the American Revolutionary War. She was the youngest of 11 children born to Esther Bowes Sayer and her husband, William Augustus Attlee, who was a Pennsylvania Supreme Court judge and whose home was located on the northwest corner of Duke and Orange Streets, just across the street from St. James Church. Judge Attlee was a longtime warden of this congregation. Charlotte's home was described as, and I quote, "the resort of the beauty and intelligence of the surrounding county." And yet her pleasant childhood was ruptured by two very sorrowful events. 1 week before Charlotte's 8th birthday, her mother died. 3 years later, her father died of cholera. The two deaths left Charlotte an 11-year-old orphan. And so she was sent to live with her oldest sister in Rutland, Massachusetts, in the very center of that state. In 1803, at age 21, Charlotte married Nathaniel Hazen White, a merchant in Rutland. A year later, the Whites welcomed a newborn son whom they named Nathaniel White after his father. But then once again, two unexpected deaths shattered Charlotte's world. Nathaniel White, her husband, died on Christmas Day, 1804. 5 months later, their 9-month-old baby boy died. Both were laid to rest at the old burial ground in Rutland. Charlotte was now widowed and childless. In the midst of that dual trauma, she moved 70 miles away to Haverhill, Massachusetts, on the Merrimack River, home to many of Nathaniel White's relatives. In Haverhill, Charlotte experienced a spiritual renewal that led her to seek baptism by immersion in the Merrimack River and to join the Baptist Church. We know about her baptism because it was witnessed by a lawyer in town. His name was Leverett Saltonstall, and he was a member of the Congregational Church. He sometimes visited the Baptist Church. He commented in his journal about the manner in which Baptists conducted baptism. He referred to it as plunging. His journal shows that he was among the people that gathered on the banks of the Merrimack on the day that Charlotte White and one other woman were being baptized. He described it in his journal about how Charlotte waded into the water, and as she waded into the water, she began to sing. Have you ever noticed how sometimes the very same action that may be done by a man and a woman, those two events are characterized, are interpreted very differently? Well, lawyer Saltonstall recorded in his journal that when she struck up a tune at her plunging, he felt it was very unnecessary, quite unseemly. He said she had a rather romantic personality, which I presume now has simply been turned toward religion. Rather than being able to see this as an expression of sincere spirituality, lawyer Saltonstall attributed it to her romanticism. Well, at the church in Haverhill, Charlotte became acquainted with many people who were quite active in supporting missionaries both among the Native American nations and also British missionaries serving in India. Until the end of the Revolutionary War, all of the pastors here at St. James had been missionary priests appointed by the Church of England's Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, the so-called SPG. Charlotte's uncle, Reverend John Sayer, had been an SPG missionary who served in New York. But in Haverhill, Charlotte encountered a great deal of activity that led her to discern a call to missionary service for herself. Shortly after that, she moved to Philadelphia, where she joined the Sansom Street Baptist Church, a unique circular building whose pastor, the Reverend William Stoughton, had helped to form the Baptist Missionary Society in England. Stoughton had also helped to send William Carey as the first British Baptist missionary to India, and regularly corresponded with Carey and other British Baptist missionaries in India while Stoughton was in Philadelphia. In 1814, Stoughton became the founding head of the Baptist Board of Foreign Missions, which immediately appointed its first missionary, the Reverend Adoniram Judson, who was already in Burma working to translate the Bible into Burmese. Adoniram Judson was there working in partnership with his wife Anne. The board, however, did not appoint his wife Anne. The board considered that the wives of missionaries were volunteers who were being sent to assist their husbands because the men were the true missionaries. Charlotte helped to form and lead the Sansom Street Baptist Female Society for the promotion of evangelical missions. A year later, she applied to the Baptist Board of Foreign Missions for her own appointment, and in June 1815, the board did appoint her to become an international cross-cultural missionary. Appointing Charlotte was controversial, highly controversial. Although other American women had preceded Charlotte into mission service, none of them had been appointed. All had been regarded as those volunteer assistants to the male missionaries. No denomination or mission society in America had ever appointed a woman. In the late 1700s and increasingly through the 1800s, most Americans expected women to confine their activities to the domestic sphere of home, family, church, and, if they were middle class, social visits, while men pursued engagement in the public sphere, industry, commerce, medicine, law, politics. One man reflected on this division of labor during his rural Indiana childhood in the 1820s by recalling, and I quote, "There was no such thing as a woman teacher. It wasn't a woman's job, any more than milking a cow was a man's job." The ideology of separate spheres was intentionally promoted and written into law. The English jurist Sir William Blackstone, in his Commentaries on the Laws of England, had famously stated, and I quote, "By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage." This social context heightened the distinction between appointing a missionary and sending one. Appointment had organizational significance by making the missionary an agent of the sending body and establishing mutual accountability between the two. It also had spiritual significance that bore some similarity to a pastor's ordination. The presupposition that missionary appointment was in the public sphere meant that it was not a role for a woman. One of the members of the Baptist Board was the Reverend Henry Holcomb, pastor of the First Baptist Church in Philadelphia. Holcomb had earlier written a circular letter to a church association discussing the proper role of women in the church. Women in the church, he said, were helpful and ornamental, but women were inferior in some respects to men. It was man who was created in the image of God, said Holcomb, not woman. Women should never assume any role in the church that usurped the authority of a man. And as a consequence, Holcomb voted against appointing Charlotte as a missionary because she was not an ordained man. Now, the problem for Holcomb, however, was that the board's constitution used the word missionary but did not define it. The Jesuits had coined the word in the 1500s, but the board's constitution did not stipulate that the word missionary referred only to an ordained man. Holcomb's attempt to revoke Charlotte's appointment, therefore, failed. Although Charlotte had been legally appointed, several members questioned whether the board had sufficient funds to send her. Charlotte may have anticipated that objection because she had a modest estate, whether from her deceased parents or her deceased husband, but Charlotte pledged that estate to the board on the condition that they would use the money for her own expenses. For the next decade, Charlotte funded her mission work by herself. Charlotte sailed to India with another newly appointed missionary, Reverend George Howe. The Judsons in Burma had now translated portions of the Bible into Burmese and needed someone who could print and distribute the material. George Howe had those skills because he had been a printer before he became a pastor. Charlotte accompanied George, his wife Phoebe, and their 2 young children as they all sailed to Calcutta, India. William Carey and the British Baptist missionaries located at Serampore, north of Calcutta, had a printing press that they were donating to the Judsons' work in Burma. The journey to Calcutta took 4 months. Charlotte and the Hos stayed at Serampore, where Charlotte began learning to speak Burmese. There she met Reverend Joshua Rowe, a British Baptist missionary whose wife had died several years earlier, leaving him the father of 3 small sons. It took 2 months to find a ship that could take the American missionaries and the printing press from Calcutta, India, to Rangoon, Burma. By that time, Charlotte White and Joshua Rowe had become husband and wife. The wedding ceremony took place at St. John's Anglican Cathedral in Calcutta, an imposing church that had been built by the East India Company that ruled 3 large portions of India on behalf of the British Crown. It's really hard for us to comprehend the power of the East India Company. It had started out as a joint venture by a few merchants in London. They put their funds together and purchased a ship. The stunning success of their first endeavor came from bringing nutmeg from Indonesia to England, where the nutmeg's subsequent London street price fetched a phenomenal 3,200% profit. Speculators quickly wanted a part of the wealth, and in 1600 they formed themselves into the Company of Merchants of London, trading into the East Indies. The company soon diversified into anything that would yield profit for its stockholders, including cotton, tea, saltpeter, silk, salt, coffee, and eventually opium. Queen Elizabeth I gave the company a 15-year monopoly on Eastern trade. Her successor, King James I, made the monopoly indefinite. Its growing wealth and influence led the company to refer to itself as the grandest society of merchants in the universe. It grew to have its own army and navy, coined its own currency, created its own laws, established its presence in India either with the consent or the conquest of local rulers, and administered colonial rule on behalf of the crown. It built the city of Bombay and constructed huge forts at Madras and Calcutta. The East India Company was invariably referred to as the Honorable Company. Charlotte and Joshua Rowe would have many interactions with the East India Company that ruled their portion of India. Charlotte and Joshua moved some 360 miles northwest of Calcutta to Digha, a village of some 500 homes. 10 miles to the east of Digha stood the ancient city of Patna, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. Patna, at this time, had become a major commercial center through which the East India Company shipped its goods. Just 1 mile to the west of Digha was the city of Dinapur, where a large cantonment was located. Sometimes companies of His Majesty's troops were stationed at that military encampment, but more often the soldiers from the Honorable Company were stationed there. The Baptist mission was located directly on the bank of the Ganges. Charlotte drew this map of the property showing 2 square bungalows in the center. To the north of the smaller bungalow on the right lay a circular garden leading to a terrace overlooking the river. The upper left portion of the map shows how the Ganges was steadily eroding the bank, and by the time Charlotte arrived, a 3rd bungalow had already collapsed into the river. Charlotte immediately began learning to read and write Hindi, and she soon became fluent and began her work as an educator. She started schools where children were taught in Hindi rather than English. She wrote a Hindi spelling book and a Hindi grammar as educational tools. She advocated for the education of girls as well as boys. She started coeducational schools and several girls' schools. She hired men to teach the boys' schools, but women teachers were extremely rare. As a result, Charlotte taught some adult women, and then recruited those with the needed skills to be teachers in the girls' schools she was starting. In Digha, Charlotte again faced controversy, for she was teaching Indian children to read. The powerful East India Company feared that an educated populace could imperil colonial rule and, of course, the company's profits. Some local people were also wary of education, especially educating girls. In one community, girls fled the school when a rumor circulated that as soon as the girls received a competent education, they would be kidnapped, tied up in bags, and shipped off to England. It took Charlotte some time to once again encourage families to send their daughters back to that school. Despite opposition from multiple sources, Charlotte persisted. She continued starting schools in nearby communities and financed the schools by raising subscriptions for those purposes. To gain support, she needed to convince potential donors that girls, as well as boys, could learn and could benefit from education. So she decided to offer some proof. She invited a select group of European expatriates to witness something they had never seen before: the first public examination of mission school students. Charlotte knew that without seeing it for themselves, many expatriates would not believe that such schools even existed, much less be convinced of their utility. All of her invited guests were impressed that 55 girls and 159 boys were being instructed and could respond to the questions on the test. Charlotte was often carried in a palanquin to oversee her schools. She eventually came to have 10 schools. So she would be carried from place to place to oversee the schools, negotiate with local landlords to secure rent-free locations for her schools. The villages around Digha, however, were on a flat, poorly drained plain that was subject to significant flooding during the raining season. The school building at one village was a mud hut. It was small, dark, crowded. She called it quite disgustful. In the dry season, the yard was crowded with feeding cattle that filled the hut with suffocating animal fumes. When Charlotte visited the school following the rains, the condition was even worse. The yard overflowed with muddy water. Men had to wade waist deep to carry Charlotte to the hut's door, where she entered with some difficulty. 35 boys and 10 girls awaited her inside that hut. Determined that these children deserved better learning conditions, Charlotte resolved to replace the inadequate schoolhouses with healthier buildings on sites less prone to flooding. Now, brick buildings certainly endured longer, but those made of bamboo and grass were less expensive and provided better ventilation. As Charlotte solicited funds from the expatriate community, she again encountered resistance. Some of them were quite willing to loan her money if the money were to be used for her personal needs, but most of them believed that local children didn't need schools. They're better left as they are. But Charlotte would not be deterred. She continued reaching out to find individuals who endorsed her vision and who provided funding. When her husband, Joshua Rowe, had been in Calcutta before their marriage, He had learned and preached in Bengali. At Digha, however, he never became fluent in Hindi and always needed a translator. As a result, he worked among English-speaking people, most of whom were either employees of the East India Company or soldiers at the cantonment in Dinapur. Joshua Rowe preached regularly at the Dinapur cantonment, where a congregation formed among the soldiers. At first, the soldiers erected a chapel between the barracks made out of grass and bamboo, much like those schools, which they dubbed the Grass Tabernacle. When the building was too small, the soldiers tore it down and replaced it with this brick building, which still stands today. Joshua and Charlotte Rowe worked together for 7 years. He as a pastor, and she as an educator. During that time, Charlotte gave birth to twin daughters, Esther Anna Rowe, named after Charlotte's mother, Esther Attlee, and Charlotte Elizabeth Rowe, named after Charlotte herself. Then Charlotte and Joshua had a baby boy, Edwin Augustus Rowe, named after Charlotte's brother in Philadelphia, with whom she felt particularly close and to whom she often wrote. While contending with controversies and challenges related to education, Charlotte nevertheless had to withstand yet another struggle. Although controversy over Charlotte's appointment had faded in Philadelphia, a new scandal erupted in 1821. You see, Charlotte had shared private thoughts in her letters to her brother, Edwin Augustus Attlee. Edwin was a Philadelphia physician, but without her knowledge or permission, Dr. Attlee had shown one of her letters to a religious visionary in Philadelphia named Theophilus Ransom Gates. Gates was the editor of The Reformer, a radical monthly newspaper. Gates, who published 4 separate newspapers in Philadelphia, rejected all forms of organized religion, including mission societies. The Reformer newspaper had already accused the British missionaries in Serampore of stealing their mission society's property. Gates now printed an anonymous extract from Charlotte's letter that he felt supported the claim of the theft. Subsequently, Gates named Charlotte Rowe as his source. When the controversy became known in London, the Baptist Missionary Society sent a stern letter of reprimand to the Rowes in India. Charlotte was astounded. She couldn't believe that her confidential correspondence had been repurposed in this way as anti-missionary propaganda. Although she was too far away to defend herself in the Philadelphia press, she did not lack agency. Stunned by Edwin's arrogant attitude and actions, Charlotte renamed her baby. From that time on, her son would be called Judson Ward Rowe. Rather than look to his uncle Edwin, Charlotte encouraged him to emulate her fellow missionaries, the courageous Adoniram Judson, who was laboring in Burma, and the warm-hearted William Ward, who had died of cholera in Serampore a month before little Judson's birth. Joshua Rowe, her husband, died in 1823, leaving Charlotte the single parent now of 6 children. For the next 3 years, she worked at Digha without assistance from any other missionary colleagues. She alone managed the mission, supervised 10 schools, organized the construction and repair of school and mission buildings, led the Hindi language church at Digha, and oversaw the ministries of indigenous evangelists who referred to her as their pastress. As her philosophy and practice of mission matured, she adapted to local culture. She critiqued the role of money in missions, and she challenged the system by which new missionaries were taught Hindi in England from people for whom Hindi was a second language, rather than by local people in India for whom Hindi was their mother tongue. In 1826, the Baptist Missionary Society in London informed Charlotte that hereafter she would have to bear the cost of maintaining the mission buildings in Digha by herself. That extra expense threw Charlotte's finances off balance. Her careful efforts at self-support were now unsustainable. She knew that the mission could successfully be financed and strengthened if the society would appoint her, give her a modest salary, and then send two new missionary couples to join the work at Digha. But Charlotte simply could not negotiate with the Mission Society in London through letters that took 5 to 6 months to travel from Digha to London while she accumulated debt in India awaiting a clear response. And so Charlotte prepared to travel to England to talk directly with the heads of the Mission Society. She planned the voyage for herself, her twin daughters, her son, and 2 small children of another missionary whose wife had just passed away. Charlotte had always taken great pains to pay all personal expenses from her own resources to assure the society that its money was used exclusively for mission purposes. Although the trip to England clearly served the needs of the mission, Charlotte did not leave until she could travel without costing the society any expense. Even in this, she paid her own way. Charlotte left Digha on November 1st, 1826, in a budgerow. That's one of the cumbersome, rudderless river barges that plied the Ganges, operated by a crew of 8 boatmen and 2 servants. Charlotte's shelter on the barge consisted of a room constructed of mats with a thatched roof. The barge floated down the river during the day and moored along the shore at night. Just north of Calcutta, Charlotte came upon a sight that seared itself into her memory. For there, at the river's edge, lay a man's corpse with its feet touching the Ganges' holy water and its head cradled in the widow's lap. Charlotte was taken aback as she watched men preparing a funeral pyre, 2 young children standing beside the widow, and other women prompting her to throw herself onto her husband's burning corpse to die. Charlotte asked the oarsman to stop. She spoke to the widow in Hindi, appealing to her to save herself, if not for her own sake, for the sake of her children and her grandchildren. The boatman in the budgerow joined Charlotte, trying to urge the widow to refrain from killing herself, saying that the missionaries would provide for her if she came with Charlotte. But by this time the crowd was growing boisterous. Charlotte could not bear to watch the widow burn herself alive, so she asked the boatman to push back and continue on down the river. Later, she learned that the woman had thrown herself into the fire. Nevertheless, Charlotte had not simply passed by. She had not remained silent. Even in those final hours in India, she had offered herself as an instrument to do what she could. When Charlotte finally arrived in London, she found that gender bias was as strong in England as in America. Appointing her, a woman, would stir as much controversy in London as it had in Philadelphia. When the London Society held its Jubilee meeting 15 years later, one of the speakers addressed the women in the audience by saying to them, "Ladies, It is not yours to be supreme, it is ours. It is yours to obey. But though it is ours to be supreme, yet it is a supremacy in which there is to be nothing capricious, nothing tyrannical. You are not to be our drudges today and our toys tomorrow. You are our companions. You are our helpmates. When Charlotte arrived at the London offices of the Baptist Missionary Society, she arrived as the widow of a missionary. When she left the offices, she left as the widow of a missionary. Charlotte spent about 3 years in England. We do not know what activities she took part in. Potentially, she may have been raising money to travel on to America. We know that she settled for a short while in the town of Yeovil, which had a thriving leather industry and for which jobs were readily available. Nevertheless, in 1829, Charlotte, with the 3 children, returned to the United States, while the 3 older stepsons remained in jobs and apprenticeships in India. Charlotte's work in India was now over. Back in Philadelphia, Charlotte rented a house in which she opened a small girls' school. While teaching and caring for her family, she also wrote newspaper articles about her experiences in India. 4 years later, she moved her family to the South, where she and her 17-year-old daughter, Charlotte Elizabeth, taught at an academy in Loudonsboro, Alabama. Now, the move from one of the largest cities in the United States to the small Alabama town may have been for the sake of her son's health. He had almost died from illness in India, and Philadelphia winters may have been problematic for a child accustomed to warmer climate. No record of her son has been found following the family's move to Alabama. By 1850, Charlotte and her daughters had returned north to Pennsylvania and settled in Strasburg, just 8 miles southeast of her early childhood home here in Lancaster. Strasburg's identity as a cultural and educational center far exceeded anything Charlotte had found in Alabama. The 1800s had brought on a flood of schools in Strasburg. Ads for the Strasburg Academy appeared in newspapers from Lancaster and Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. The principal of the academy also made visits to Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. to recruit students. The academy's growing reputation attracted students from other states as well as from Cuba and Puerto Rico. The Strasburg Female Seminary opened in 1841 to offer classical education for girls. By 1845, the seminary had 20 students. The Boys' Academy and the Girls' Seminary complemented each other by making it possible for families with sons and daughters to send them together for education in Strasburg. The seminary, however, struggled to maintain sufficient enrollment and closed in the late 1840s. This created the need to find a new principal who could revive the school. Now, it's unclear how leaders in Strasburg became acquainted with Charlotte Rowe. Charlotte was not a person who sought fame, and she was not then publicly known for being the first American woman to be appointed as a missionary. However, in 1849, the academy included some boys from the state of Alabama. Charlotte may have become known through the academy's ties to those Alabama families. Charlotte was then 67 years old and had had significant administrative and teaching experience, especially her substantial accomplishments of starting and supervising schools in India. Since Charlotte's twin daughters accompanied her from Alabama to Strasburg, Charlotte's daughter, Charlotte Elizabeth, who was then 31 years old, was employed as an assistant teacher while Charlotte herself became the seminary's new principal. The remaining twin, Esther Anna, seems to have suffered from poor health, resulting from a near-death illness in India. Although Sissy, as they called her, had enjoyed reading as a child, her eyesight was very weak. In the midst of the rejuvenated reopening of the Strasbourg Female Seminary, Charlotte's life was shaken once again by two deaths that happened in rapid succession. In March 1851, her daughter Esther died, unmarried at age 32. Charlotte brought Esther's body to Lancaster for burial in the St. James Cemetery near the graves of her grandparents. Charlotte's sorrow was repeated the following year, in October 1852, with the death of her remaining daughter and co-teacher, Charlotte Elizabeth. Also unmarried, Charlotte Elizabeth had died one day before her 34th birthday. She was buried at St. James Cemetery next to her twin sister. A single headstone marks the twins' graves. By 1853, Charlotte had returned to Philadelphia, where she lived her final years. 10 years later, in 1863, like her husband Nathaniel White, Charlotte died on Christmas Day. Her funeral was held 3 days later here at St. James. Charlotte's notable significance as America's first appointed woman missionary was long overlooked. Her work in India was long omitted from written accounts. Her work as an educator in India, as well as in Pennsylvania and Alabama, faded from public memory. The woman who dared to open the door for women to be appointed as missionaries on an equal basis with men was buried next to her twin daughters in St. James Cemetery in the middle of the winter, in the middle of the Civil War, in an unmarked grave. Thank you.
Could invite you to stay here, and perhaps Cordelia join Reid as well, and I'll manage the questions and answers, or at least catch the questions for you to answer. Any questions as you come to them, or even as we say in our own contemplative occasion here, your own reflections on what it felt to be part of that story that you are drawn into by that just remarkable lecture and description of both the life, the spirituality, the sufferings, and the astonishing gift of generosity in love and mercy that was Charlotte's just deep charism. We've also got a number of people who went to India and were there and able to share their own insights, as not least through a pandemic. You've had your own ability to reflect on that trip and journey of yours, and where, as you went through this experience, found your own life embedded. As well as the Attleys, who I really don't know very much of your history, and how the parents of Charlotte and the other relations all interspersed there. Reid.
You can hear me. I would like to appeal to the Attleys among us, both here present in this church and those that may see the presentation online. We know through Charlotte's letters to her brother, Edwin Augustus Attlee, the physician in Philadelphia, that Charlotte had sent him a diary that she had kept while she was traveling to India, those 4 months on the ocean. And we know that he had a goodly number of letters that she had exchanged with him. When she heard from him that he had given at least one of these letters to Mr. Gates, she was absolutely stunned. She said, you recall that I said these are confidential and they should not be shared with anyone without my permission. To which Edwin replied, well, you may recall that you may have asked for these to be confidential, but I never agreed to that. And of course, unless two people agree, a contract does not exist. And I just felt these were so important, I needed to share them with Mr. Gates so that the public could be aware. This truly rocked her boat. It shattered the relationship, the very close relationship that she had had. It had been a wonderful thing for her to be able to write back and forth to this close brother and to unburden herself, say things that she could say freely, but she really felt that that had not been respected. So my appeal to the Attlees is, Edwin Augustus said, you told me to burn your diary and your letters. I have not done so. They are too important. So the question is, does her diary, do these letters still exist someplace? Might any of the Attlee family know of any letters? I have tried to contact a number of universities to see among their manuscript collections if they might have any manuscripts that came from Dr. Attlee, because he was a well-known physician. But at this point, I've found nothing. He was a Quaker. I've contacted the Quaker Historical Society. They say they have no papers of Edwin Augustus Attlee. But if anyone does or hears about them, I would be very eager to be able to read them. Hello, Anne.
Because there are voluminous records, lots of records at the Lancaster Historical Society. I mean, we've taken boxes full of stuff over there, but I would assume you have checked that out.
The majority, I'm not sure now that I've heard everything that you said. Could you repeat it?
The Lancaster Historical Society here and its great range of papers that may overlap with the Attlee collection, and whether people have found them within that collection. How much research have you been able to do at Lancaster History thus far, or some of us could undertake for you?
Yes, I would like to and need to do more research there. I've asked the staff if they have any correspondence from Charlotte, and they have said they don't. Now, that being said, it is possible that there might be some letters mingled in to the other things. The largest trove of letters that inform the research that I did are preserved at the Angus Library and Archive in Oxford, England. And so that's been a wealth of information, but they do not have that diary.
I guess I just have a question of whether or not there were any other female missionaries that had been appointed to the role to serve in India or anywhere else, kind of following in Charlotte's footsteps.
The question, as I understand it, is were there any other women who were appointed? In 1820, this would be 5 years after Charlotte was appointed, there was one single woman from the Great Valley that was appointed as a missionary. There were about 20 people from the Baptist Church of the Great Valley that took a wagon train south to Tennessee to the Cherokee Nation. And they went as missionary volunteers. Several of those individuals stayed rather than just being there for a shorter period of time and were appointed. So one of those women was appointed. She was the second woman to be appointed after Charlotte. A few years after that, a woman of Native American heritage from New England was likewise appointed for work among the Native American nations. What began to happen was, first of all, missionaries to the Native American nations were being appointed by this foreign missionary society because the Native American nations were understood to be foreign nations. That's why the U.S. government dealt with them by treaty, just as you deal with treaties with Germany or France or Spain or England. So it was considered to be under the aegis of the foreign society. So there were increasing numbers of single women who were appointed, quite often as teachers, to work in North America among the Native American nations. In the case of couples, only the husband would be appointed, and his wife was not. In the 1840s, there started to be some single women appointed for mission work overseas. These were almost invariably siblings or children of missionaries already serving there. So it might be a daughter who had come back to the United States for schooling, was then appointed to return to whether it was Burma or Thailand or China to serve alongside as part of the family. Gradually, the Mission Society began to appoint single women if they were engaged to be married to an appointed missionary. So they would be appointed, and then shortly thereafter would be married, and in that case, the husband and wife were both appointed. This, however, created the anomaly that in China or in Burma or Siam, as Thailand was called at that point, you had a number of missionary wives who were doing the same work, some of whom were appointed and others were not. So the urgings that women more regularly be appointed, not only single women, but also wives of missionaries, this case was being raised. In terms of the Baptist Society, that decision to appoint wives of missionaries, as well as single women missionaries, took place in 1912. Over 200 women on that one day became missionaries. So it was about a 100-year process from the time that Charlotte was first appointed till the time when all women would be appointed equally, on an equal basis with men.
I can use this system, I think, if it goes on. Maybe not. Yes, I just wanted to ask you, Reid, going to India, what was the sort of most significant or meaningful thing that you or you saw or that you remember now, of all the things that we saw from the cathedral in Calcutta to trying to find Joshua Rowe's gravestone in the jungle? Those are my memories anyway, as well as Serampore College, which was pretty amazing. But I wonder what you would draw attention to.
one of the sights that Charlotte saw when she was in Serampore and Calcutta was the Baptist chapel in Calcutta, which had a baptistry in the floor right in front of the pulpit, and in which Adoniram Judson had been baptized. You see, Judson and his wife Anne had been appointed as Congregationalist missionaries. There was also a single man, Luther Rice, who was among the group of Congregationalists who were appointed, 5 men and 3 wives, appointed in 1812. They were sent by the Congregationalists. One ship left Salem, and the other ship left Philadelphia. It was prudent for them to travel the ocean in 2 different ships in case one ship didn't make it. And it might not make it because of storms, because of pirates, because of being captured by the British. Who knew? But as the Judsons were sailing, they began studying scriptural passages related to baptism because they knew they were going to meet the British Baptists in India. And I think they figured, we need to be able to explain why we as Congregationalists baptize infants. The problem was that by the time they got to Calcutta, they had grudgingly come to the conclusion that in their view, the baptism of adults was more substantiated in Scripture than the baptism of infants. What they didn't know was that in the other ship, Luther Rice was also doing the same thing. So the Judsons and Rice were baptized by immersion, one might say rebaptized since they had been baptized as infants, in that chapel in Calcutta. And that was one of the things that Charlotte had seen. And that was a very poignant kind of connection for me, particularly because the Judsons really, their story was what got me involved in the story of Charlotte Rowe. I had been involved with the Baptist Mission Society for about 20 years. The last 10 of those years as the executive director, the CEO of the mission. I knew quite a bit, if I say so myself, about particularly the early years of the Baptist work. And in 2014, we were coming up on the 200th anniversary of the Mission Society. So I wanted to dig into the archives to get some more details about that first generation of missionaries. Baptists typically refer to Anne and Adoniram Judson as the first missionaries, and I assumed that they both had been appointed. So I was shocked to notice that only he was appointed. And then as I looked at other records, I saw that none of the wives were being appointed, only the men. Adoniram is appointed in 1814, but then I came across this name, Charlotte White, appointed in 1815 to go to Burma to work with the Judsons. I had not found anything in the material about the early work in Burma that even mentioned a Charlotte White. And then I found in the records the record of a Charlotte Rowe, whose service with the board was ended. And she seemed to be the same person. And then as I did more study, it increasingly became evident to me that Charlotte's appointment in 1815 was the first time any woman in America was appointed as a missionary by any denomination or mission agency. So I thought, who is this woman? Why have I never heard of her? Why don't I read about her in Burma? What happened to her? And that began the journey, which has ended up bringing me here.
Thank you, Reid. That's really great. Anyone else? Yes, Brad, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you. I didn't really expect to be drawn in today quite so much. It was fascinating, so thank you for sharing that. story. It's new to me. What I'm interested in is two parts really. I kept getting struck with the idea of perseverance, and the constant getting back up and keeping going, and how far away from home, and these punitive things that kept happening to her, the loss of her husband and her children, and even her own brother in that way. The perseverance strikes me, but I also have a personal interest in trauma and loss and grief. I don't imagine you might, but perhaps, were you able to glean anything of the woman herself? Do we know much about Charlotte's, how did she deal with, constantly having to reinvent, and work through it? Were you able to glean anything of that?
Well, this is one of the reasons I would dearly love to find her diary, because I suspect that she may have expressed more personal feelings in the diary than she did in her letters. Typically, letters, unless you specifically had an agreement that this is confidential correspondence, which she thought she did, typically letters from missionaries were considered public news. And those letters would be shared with religious magazines, with secular newspapers. Extracts would be printed. So I'm quite sure that except for her correspondence with her brother, she knew that anything that she wrote could see the public. So it's a bit difficult to know what her inner feelings were. She does at one point, and this is towards the end of her service, she comments that she was disappointed that there were relatively few students who chose to become followers of Christ through their exposure to Christianity in the schools. In one school, about half of the students became Christians. But in the other schools, it would only be one or two here or there. And she says it's like planting wheat in the wintertime. And the ground is frozen, and you're not going to see any fruit from that. But when the sunshine comes out in the spring and the early summer, some of that seed, she believed, would take root and become fruitful. She referred to herself as a mere instrument. She, in writing to her mother-in-law, Joshua Rowe's mother in England, she says, "I consider myself a mere instrument. If God uses me not, I can do nothing. But with God's help, I can accomplish things." She also, on another occasion, referred to herself. She says, "I'm like the ants that build the huge ant hills on the Indian plains. I feel I'm like one of those little ants that's doing its little part to build that great anthill. I do my little works, many little works." So she was self-deprecating, clearly reflective, and I'd love to be able to know more about that side of Charlotte.
Did you come across any evidence of people who were inspired by her to their own adventures, whether that was signing up to be a missionary or something quite different, but said, if this woman can be an instrument of God, so can I?
Charlotte had a niece who was appointed as a missionary, first as a missionary among the Delaware nation, the Lenni Lenape. She served as an educator for several years, then ill health caused her to leave that for a while. But then she was reappointed and went to Burma and served for a number of years as a single woman missionary in Burma. Charlotte also had a great nephew who was appointed for service, also an educator, who served in Burma for something like 40 years, and during his time ended up training about 1,000 Burmese people for pastoral ministry in Burma. Now, what I don't have are specific letters from either the niece or the great-nephew that reflect on the extent to which the example of the aunt or great-aunt had been part of their discernment of the missionary call. And again, part of the problem was, remember I said that she sailed to India with George Howe? In those early records, there will be references to Reverend Howe being sent as a missionary, the first fruits of mission from America sent to Asia, and no comment that he was accompanied by Charlotte White. Even when she is working in India, having married Joshua Rowe, many of the reports that are printed in the United States and in England will refer to Reverend Joshua Rowe, the missionary at Digha, but say nothing about her. Or if she's referred to, it will be the widow of, or the wife of, and her name is absent.
I have a question. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Thanks for your good work and being here. How did you find the evidence of the anti-education attitude by the East India Company expressed toward her and what the young women were getting? I'm sure it's in your book, but could you share that a bit, please?
That's another good question. You folks are asking some very good questions. We know that the East India Company had that attitude because every so many years they had to renew their charter with the Crown in order to continue to have that monopoly. William Wilberforce, of anti-slavery fame, argued that the East India Company should be required to provide educational opportunities for Indian children. The company argued against it. Again, with this rationale that that may upset the local people. One of the directors from the East India Company, in fact, stood before Parliament and said, one of the reasons that we lost the American colonies was because we allowed schools and even colleges to be started in the American colonies. We ought not repeat that folly in India. So it's fairly well documented.
Well, friends, it would be wonderful to invite you to the rectory so that we can share in a time of fellowship. But I want to thank Reid so profoundly, Cordelia and Leo, and all those who have been working together with you, including, of course, the new boards that are going to be coming thanks to the work that Randall and Cordelia have worked on together. Our joy to be able to connect on that will deepen, and we look forward to more chance for you to speak with Reid, get a book signed by Reid, as well as eat and drink together. But please.
I would be remiss if I did not introduce to you the delegation of folks that traveled with me to India in 2019. I won't introduce them all by name. You'll have a chance to meet them in the rectory. But I would like to ask those that traveled as part of that delegation, would you please stand and turn around so others can see whom you are? We have people who came here today from West Virginia, from Wisconsin, from Kansas, from Maine, from Pennsylvania. And I appreciate it.
That grace of commitment to one another and to this communion of saints, which I suspect it's not known to many, but today is the feast day of James Lloyd Breck, and he was one of the great missionaries of the Episcopal Church in the Western Reserve, in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, to the Oneida Nation, and on to the West Coast. Born in 1818 in Philadelphia and dying in the 1870s in California. He came to a total commitment of his life for Christ under the tutelage and at the school of William Augustus Muhlenberg, a priest of this parish and the pioneer of the church school movement that sought to utilize not only public education but also independent education as a means of cultivating and indeed renewing Christian character. And in that work from this place, we are able to knit together that communion of saints. I would like us to think about how we can make Charlotte's own life more profoundly available to the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion, as well as a sign of that ecumenical journey of hers that in life and in death bring us together. And so combining as we are able to the collect prayer for James Lloyd Breck, which is, as you will hear it, connected with Charlotte as I pray for them both by name, we will hear just how close their dates are as well as their overlapping missional lives and this weekend. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Teach your church, O Lord, we pray, to value and support pioneering and courageous missionaries, whom you call, as you called your servant, James Lloyd Breck, as well as Charlotte Attlee White Rowe, to preach and teach and plant your church on new frontiers through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you all very much, and I'll take you to the rectory where we can receive the fruits of all of the labors of Reid, as well as enjoy the fruits and labors brought to us today.